I watched the live face reveal of my favorite YouTuber. What I saw will always haunt me. I come from a small mining town in Arizona where there is not a lot to do except hike. It was a good but boring area to grow up in. Our population was small with little to no crime. My father owned the quarry where the majority of the community's economic strength came from. He left me a sizable inheritance after he passed away. I bought a truck and a house out in the plains with a basketball court and a pool. That was the extent of my lavish spending, but it was all I needed. Unless you count pizza, I didn't have many vices to blow my fortune on. I've never been an avid partygoer, luckily. Like a lot of people my age, one indulgence I did have was watching YouTube. Urban exploration became a most searched category of mine from 2009 on. I became a subscriber to a content creator and urbex vlogger named Isolation Infinity. He kept himself anonymous and did not show his face. He used footage of the haunts he went into as captured by the body camera strapped to his chest. His voice's baritone became a signature element of the channel. He traveled all over the world and went to many chilling places. These included vacant hospitals, asylums, morgues, and train stations. He even stumbled upon a murder in progress once. A homeless man had stomped another transient to death in a farmhouse. He uploaded edited parts of it. This was a controversial decision. It almost resulted in a lifetime ban for him from the platform. The clips did help law enforcement later on, nonetheless. He was also arrested a few times for trespassing on famous estates. The Houdini mansion in Los Angeles was one of them, but none of his fans held this against him. We respected him for being willing to get into trouble with the law in pursuit of the next viral video. Late last year, Isolation Infinity announced he was going to have a live face reveal. It was only going to be for his patrons, i.e., those who gave money to his Patreon account. I contributed funds to it on a monthly basis. I viewed him as a pioneer in his entertainment niche and did not mind sparing a little change. He emailed me and told me I was one of a dozen allowed to attend the live event. He further stated that it would be in a password-protected chat room. He also promised an exclusive video that would not make it onto the public video lineup. I was more interested in the latter than the former. I never cared what his appearance was since I already had a vision of someone my age, in their mid to late 20s. It was hard to convince me that he looked any different from the picture in my mind's eye. Still, I was not going to turn down the chance to find out. Being able to brag to his die-hard followers who did not get to experience it would be worth it alone. The night of the scheduled face reveal, I booted up my PC. I kicked back on a lounge chair in the second-story room of my house, which was my entertainment space. It was complete with video game consoles and my beloved Alienware computer. An open bag of peppered jerky and a bottle of ginger ale sat next to my keyboard. I went into my email. The password was in my inbox. I followed the link. It led me to the video of a room with nothing in it but a red wall with a baby blue frame. The caption Isolation Infinity will be on shortly rested at the bottom of the screen. I expected a home studio and instead got what appeared to be someone's dingy basement in need of a new coat of paint. What bothered me the most was the sound of heavy machinery whirring in the background. I wrote it off as bad plumbing. A man came into the frame. He was slim and wore a trench coat with maroon buttons on the front. He reached down, grabbed the lens of the camera, and shifted it upward. The familiar voice we had all grown fond of started to count down. "Are you ready to see who I am?" Isolation Infinity asked. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 5, he hoisted it upward and pointed it at his face. I froze. He looked nothing like what I had visualized. He was hairless, emaciated, pale, and had marble black eyes. He reminded me of Werner Krauss from the old German 1920 film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. His mouth hung open and tilted to the side, as if he could not control the movement of his jaw. The most alarming thing to me was not how flattering his features were. That explained why he valued being off camera for most of his career. What upset me the most, in the beginning, was how the disparity in his perceived age made me feel lied to. He always told his fans he was a young man, like most of his demographic. The individual before me on the screen was in his 50s at the earliest. "I have been fantasizing about broadcasting this for a long time," he said, as he licked his lips. "You have made this possible, and so I need to show my appreciation by giving thanks in the most sincere way I know how." He moved the camera to the left, and I could not believe what I saw. A woman in her 30s sat on a grimy floor, her head down from evident exhaustion. Rusted chains circled her arms. She wore a tattered black top, as though someone's knife or nails had left wounds on portions of her torso. Stains were on her clothes. She had spent time in the dirt fighting someone or clawing her way out of a soiled embankment before this. "Say something," he ordered her. "Tell them you can't wait to die." The blades of a chainsaw came into view, and its motor revved. She whimpered with pain, and when she tried to murmur something, I saw blood dripping from her mouth. I dragged the mouse cursor over to the right-hand side of the screen to see how many people were in the chat. The answer I received left me weak. No one else was there but me. The others had either left or were never there to begin with, and I was too stupid to notice until then. My heartbeat increased as I tried to close the window. I could not. The X symbol on the right-hand side was visible but useless. It was like every virus-infected pop-up ad you could not escape from. "What Infinity Isolation?" asked. "You don't like it, Mark. Everything I do is to make my most devoted subscribers happy." A chill ran through me. He knew my name. It took me a second to realize he had gotten it through my membership in his Patreon. The fact that he was aware that I was his only viewer worried me. Was I going to be the sole witness to a barbaric act of murder? "Calm down," I reassured myself. "This is an elaborate prank he's recording right now. He's wearing scary Hollywood makeup. And she's an actress. This is all for the sake of getting more views. The chainsaw has to be a prop bought off Etsy.com. Still, my hand inched towards the phone to call 911. The way the woman expressed her misery in the moment was all too convincing. I held my device closer to my ear. "I wouldn't do that if I was you, Mark." He stared right at the screen for a moment, his eyes making perfect contact with mine. Can he see me? He lifted the chainsaw above the woman's head. He brought it down with a noise from his throat, which sounded like a cross between a scream and a laugh. A fountain of gore spurted out. The lens got hit with crimson bubbles. He cackled as I unplugged my computer. I carried it downstairs to my car and drove to the nearest police station. I filled out an incident report in an office with a dying lamp and the scowl of a detective facing me. He looked as though he would have rather been anywhere else but at work. For the first 2 hours there, I had to convince them that I was not a crazy person. They thought I was there to waste their time with a fanciful tale of my correspondence with some creep. "I hope it was all a hoax," I said. "If this is not real, no one would be happier about it than me. Here's my computer. See if you can't trace where he's at in case." I gagged before I could complete my thought. The idea of it being authentic was overwhelming. They had cybercriminals go over everything. And a few days later, I got my PC back. It took about a week before I received a call from someone working on the case. She was a homicide investigator named Samantha Brown. "We found the killer was streaming from a bunker in Virginia," she said. "It's an old fallout shelter abandoned since the Cold War. He calls himself the I-73 Butcher since that highway is his preferred route. He uses it as a screen name on the dark web." "Infinity Isolation is a serial killer?" I asked, feeling a knot in my stomach. "No," she said. "The real Isolation Infinity is someone else. This maniac poses as a famous person. He uses a combination of tools, including voice-altering software and encrypted Wi-Fi. He hacks into their accounts. He gets a thrill out of making complete strangers watch his acts of terror. His tech-savvy ways also allow him to control other people's webcams, and we don't know how many he has breached. He is on several of the most wanted lists of different agencies. We have never found out what he looks like. The faces he uses on those terrible live streams are prosthetic. He has maintained strict anonymity and avoided the news cycle. I'm sorry you saw such torment. The good part is that your turning in your computer helped us at least find out his last known whereabouts. The scene's been searched, and we have some evidence. He's still out there somewhere. For now." I went to bed that night with a host of emotions. I felt violated by a complete monster that sabotaged my privacy. Moreover, I felt dumb for getting swindled. I still feel shivers over the fact that he was not apprehended. Word of what happened got to the real Isolation Infinity, who has as of late deleted his entire channel. Many speculated on how victims mistaking him for an insane person perturbed him. Sometimes, as I lay my head down and drift off to sleep, I hear a noise by my window. I jump up and think it is a chainsaw. Thus far, it has been a neighbor's lawnmower every time. I hope it stays that way. I'm a coroner. I've only had one strange encounter in my career, but it still keeps me up at night. I don't get freaked out by much. I'm neither a squeamish person nor a superstitious one. You can't be in my line of work. But I can't explain John Doe. We don't get any murders in my city. Overall, we're a pretty quiet and safe community. It's rare that a full autopsy is required, and it's more likely to be requested for unexpected deaths, medical malpractice, or that kind of thing than it is for a suspected murder. We don't have a separate medical examiner's office. I'm just in the basement of the hospital, which frankly isn't much of a hospital. It's better equipped than a typical doctor's office, but there are outpatient centers that are bigger than ours if you go to a big city. If you have a complicated illness, you drive a few hours to Cleveland. However, I'm our coroner. I certify all deaths in the city and perform all our autopsies. When an unknown body turned up in the woods, you better believe the cops were all over it. It was the only exciting thing to happen to them that week. Hell, maybe ever. Several more officers than were necessary came in with the paramedics, looking for some answers on how he'd gotten there. I didn't know. He didn't have any defensive wounds. There was nothing in the initial exterior examination. Livor mortis and rigor mortis were present. I estimated the death at around 12 hours prior. The x-rays came back normal. There were no obvious signs of poisoning upon interior examination. The contents of the stomach were a half-digestible tuna sandwich and I think a Coke. His heart was enlarged, but not abnormally so. It was indicative of cardiomyopathy. But this is the United States of America. We're all fat and have heart disease. The one weird thing was that we had trouble getting prints. No matter how we took them, they just looked blurred. The police couldn't run them. But his fingertips didn't appear to be damaged in any way. On visual inspection, they appeared normal. Due to the lack of any other evidence, I would have guessed a heart attack if I hadn't known the circumstances. But he was found a mile into the woods, stark naked, a few feet off the trail. The most likely cause, I felt, was poison. There weren't obvious signs, but sometimes there aren't, depending on what was used. He didn't have dirty feet, which meant he probably didn't strip naked and go for a run. He was likely placed there after his death. I told the police as much. I packed his organs back into his chest cavity, his brain back in his skull, and put him away. I sent the samples to the lab for testing, but it takes a while, and the really comprehensive panels are expensive enough that the department didn't want to pay for them. I mean, you don't show up in the woods naked by yourself in the middle of the night, and then die of natural causes, typically. He didn't show any obvious signs of a drug overdose. The police believed it was a homicide, but without any evidence, I ruled the cause of death undetermined. We left it there. And that was the last I thought of it, until the lab called me to ask what the hell I had sent them. The lab results were inconclusive. They couldn't get any DNA from the samples at all. I went to get the body back out and take some more samples. Maybe look at some new tissue slides under the microscope again. But he wasn't where I left him. I looked high and low, meaning in each cold locker, thinking I had mislabeled or misremembered where I put him, but he wasn't in any of them. It's not a large morgue. It's not like misplacing your keys. If I couldn't find the body, it was gone. I didn't like that at all. To be honest with you, I panicked. How do you lose a body? In all my years in the field, I had never heard of such a thing happening. I called up the chief of police and explained the situation. He asked some questions I wasn't sure of the answers to. Yes, I'd left my office unattended on occasion. No, I hadn't been paying close attention to whether I locked it at the end of every day. I was pretty sure I did. I do so out of habit, but I wasn't completely sure. We're a small city. Safe. Stealing human remains is not the common way. It's not something I had considered a possibility. So the police added a report about the theft of human remains from government custody, which, if they ever caught the perpetrator, would be a list of charges longer than my leg. The running theory was that someone stole the remains to cover up the murder. That didn't go over well, since it implied a member of the hospital staff was likely involved. But what can you do? The police weren't too serious about pursuing it. I don't think they seriously suspected anyone at the hospital. Without an ID, it was hard to investigate. It was a decent scary story to talk about at parties, especially since the death had been well covered by the local papers. Everyone around here had heard about it. A few months went by, and honestly, I hardly thought about it anymore, though I was careful to lock the morgue when I left for the day. We were busy. We were having an unfortunate uptick in deaths, so I had gotten the okay to hire an assistant. He was a sharp kid, he learned quickly. He had a few autopsies under his belt when another body turned up. John Doe, clothed this time, Ains' not-so-white t-shirt and Levi's well-worn tennis shoes. She was called in by a scared teen who found him in the dumpster behind the fast food joint where she worked. It was a different pair of cops who responded at the scene. A whole different team of people, EMTs, everybody. Which is why I guess I was the first to notice. What the fuck, I said this when I saw his face. What, asked my assistant. This is the same guy, I said. This is the same guy that went missing before. A missing persons case. You recognize him. No, I mean the same guy, the remains that went missing. A few months ago. How is this possible? My assistant didn't have any idea, but I was highly agitated and probably not making a lot of sense. I called the police department. The two cops who brought him in this time weren't particularly helpful. They started speculating that it was a serial killer of a specific type. I called back and insisted they send some more senior guys down, the ones who picked up John Doe before. So Laurent and Bill came down to take a look. Well, I'll be goddamned, Laurent said. It's the same fucking guy. It couldn't be, Bill said. A twin, maybe. Maybe, I agreed grudgingly. It seems unlikely. Well, could it be the same guy, Laurent asked. Hear me out, what if they took the remains and frozen them? I shook my head. I performed an autopsy last time. This guy hasn't been cut open. You'd think if there was a pair of identical twins missing, someone would have reported it, Bill said. I can make a few calls. Let me know if anything comes back. The weird thing, well, one of the weird things about that body was that it was fresh. The police believed he had been in the dumpster for a few hours at most, but he could have died elsewhere and been moved, and in fact, that seemed likely based on the activity at the restaurant. However, he had no signs of lever mortis, which is discoloration of the skin due to blood pooling. The ambient temperature was quite warm, and counterintuitively, this typically accelerates the onset of rigor mortis, which begins in the fine muscles of the face before affecting the hands and then the rest of the larger muscles, making them stiff. It usually sets in about 2 to 8 hours post-mortem and lasts for about a day altogether. John Doe had no signs of rigor mortis whatsoever, nor any of the markers that come after that. In short, he was dead, but he didn't display some of the typical signs of being dead, and none of the ones that would help estimate time since death. He presented honestly, like someone who had just died on the examination table moments before. We have a set of steps we take to verify a person is actually dead. It includes an EKG. There's no way to make a mistake. The EMTs on the scene had also pronounced him dead. For what that's worth, he was dead. I felt a bit superstitious, but even so, I couldn't help but check for a pulse a few times before making an incision, just in case. I had a weird feeling that the subject wasn't dead, or, and I feel weird even saying this, just barely dead. Only mostly dead, as they said in The Princess Bride, but I mean it in a much less charming way. Something about this body felt off. However, I'm not sure if I was just jittery due to the circumstances, and hindsight does not improve my recollection of him at all. If you're a decent coroner, you're the methodical type. I'm at least halfway decent, and I wouldn't say I half-assed it the first time, but I was extremely meticulous this time. By the book, we opened him up. We examined every organ. We even cut into his limbs, which we don't normally do without a specific reason. We took a lot more samples than we had the first time. His heart was strange. I weighed it, and it was enlarged. I was planning to do a couple of cross-sections to see if it was healthy. But when I pressed into it with the scalpel, a viscous white fluid oozed out. It had a smell that seeped through my mask. My assistant had to run and retch. I don't know if you've ever vomited into a face mask and shield, but it's messy. He was effectively down for the count. The smell was like walking into a Yankee Candle store, sort of not a bad smell per se, not like a severely decomposing body, but still strong enough to make you lightheaded. I've never seen, heard, or smelled anything like it. It was like the fluid had completely filled the atrial and ventral cavities. I would have said it was like his blood had been replaced, but when we vacuumed out his chest cavity, the blood was normal. His arteries and veins were normal. It was only the heart. I guess that whatever happened must have been post-mortem, or else it would have been pumped through his arteries. But that didn't explain what had happened. I briefly debated the merits of dumping the fluid down the sink, and therefore, eventually into the municipal water supply, but decided against it. I put on fresh gloves and took a careful sample, being sure to seal it. I then put the whole metal tray full of the substance into one of the triple-bagged 5-gallon buckets we had handy. I tied the bags off, closed the lid, and then bagged the bucket for good measure. We left the room. I locked the door behind me, and we went upstairs to give my assistant a chance to recuperate. The ventilation down there is very good, so we hoped it would dissipate the smell in the meantime. When we finally went back into the room, the smell had mostly disappeared, along with the body. So had the samples, the bucket with the substance in it, and even the camera we had been photographing him with. We called the police again, and they added a note to their report. If you're wondering about security footage, we had very few cameras. They were limited to the public entrances at the front and back of the building, and in the emergency room and main corridors on the first floor. There weren't any in the stairwells, which were on either side of the building and had emergency exit doors to the outside. Nor were there any cameras in the basement, which only held the morgue, some storage rooms, and some admin offices. I know it probably seems strange to some of you, but we're a drive-by town with no real crime, and this was years ago. Cameras weren't as ubiquitous as they are today. I heard the police complain to the mayor, but the state was also in the middle of a budget crisis at that time, so I assumed they didn't have the money to add more. So, when the body showed up the third time, about 6 months later, I was beside myself. A distressed citizen called in a report of a creepy man parked in a car just outside her family's home. When dispatch sent some police to investigate, it became obvious he was dead. After they shot him. After a couple of verbal warnings, the rookie officer panicked and fired. The bullet passed through his left shoulder. Word got around the rookie was swearing up and down when he saw movement, which was clearly impossible because the man was dead. But, in fairness, most of what had occurred with this guy seemed impossible. His partner said there wasn't any movement, it was just a rookie who was trigger happy. That was the official report. But, interestingly enough, off-duty and after a few beers he confessed to Laurent, who passed it on to me, that something was not quite right about the body. He wouldn't say what. I am not sure if that's how he really felt, or if he was drunk and trying to placate Laurent, who was pissed that some white kid with a badge fired a shot at an unmoving, unresponsive person and got off with a slap on the wrist. The police didn't want word to get out about this disappearing, reappearing body. Neither did the mayor, as it wasn't good press for him. So he and the police department let our local reporters have a field day with the rookie, who ended up quitting the force and leaving town. He couldn't take the notoriety, so he left. I heard he started a landscaping business with his brother in Indiana. The third autopsy itself was mostly normal. Aside from the absence of the typical stages of death, liver, algor, and/or rigor mortis putrefaction, which I don't mean to gloss over because it is very strange, incredibly strange. It's impossible. But so is doing an autopsy on the same person 3 times. Compared to everything else, even that felt almost minor, and the autopsy felt almost normal. Honestly, in that situation, it was almost weirder than it was normal. When you're expecting something to jump out at you, every minute it doesn't is agonizing. He still didn't seem right to me, but we didn't find any other abnormalities. I kept slicing into him and expecting something mind-numbingly weird to happen. But there were no mysterious fluids. Nothing mysterious at all. There was the obvious entry and exit wound of the bullet, but nothing else, which was both not strange enough and still strange. There still weren't any obvious causes of death. I wondered if I had entered some sort of purgatory for mediocre medical examiners. Maybe this body was punishment for missing something, and I was doomed to repeat it until I found the cause of death. I was really questioning my career and my life choices by this point. When I went home, I started talking with my wife about moving closer to her family, like she'd always wanted. I don't like her family, but a fresh start in a new town seemed like a good idea. We were careful at that time about the chain of custody. The police department sent us a detail to guard the body, which mainly consisted of a guy in the basement of the hospital to watch the lockers after we left for the night. We did our thing and put the guy in cold storage. We shipped the samples to the big lab upstate. But of course it did have to get weird. Like with the previous bodies, no matter how carefully we took prints, the images always looked blurred when we tried to match them in the database. Same with his dental records. The DNA samples came back inconclusive. We sent them another sample. Same results. The police don't formally close investigations for at least a year, but we only have to hold unclaimed remains for 30 days. We kept some samples, assuming there was going to be a protracted back and forth with the lab, but we sent him for cremation as soon as it was allowed. I wanted him out of my mind. But you know the story by this point. A couple of guys came to transport him first thing. I opened the locker to pull him out, and the body was missing. So we opened every cold locker in the storage room to make sure I hadn't misplaced him. This time, we found him. I wish we hadn't. He was on top of someone else. They were lying together like someone had placed them there in the mockery of a marriage bed. I cannot stress this enough, it was deeply disturbing. And I say this as someone who has seen some pretty gruesome deaths. First of all, the girl was underage. I mean, if you're going to pull a prank like this, I guess you could argue that age doesn't really matter when you're talking about lifeless bodies. I don't know if that was the intent, but the image alone was bad. I can't forget how it looked, this middle-aged man with his arms wrapped around a blonde teenage girl. She looked like a child. She had overdosed, not disfigured by an accident or anything like that. I don't think you could mistake her for a sleeping girl, but she looked peaceful enough. And this guy, honestly, did look like he was sleeping. He just didn't look dead to me. I don't know how to describe it. I've been in this line of work for a long time, and I've never seen a body look like that. It looked like this grown man had crawled into bed to sleep with a dead little girl. Aside from the grotesqueness of the scene, it was a complicated pose. His arms were wrapped around her, so parts of him were under her, and parts of her were under him, if that makes sense. It would have taken significant manipulation of both bodies to get them into that position. It took me and my assistant both to get them separated. We didn't take pictures. It was probably protocol, it being a crime scene and all, but it didn't feel right. I didn't want evidence that her parents might see in some court case someday. I didn't pick up the camera, and no one asked me to. Everyone was pretty rattled. The techs didn't like it. The on-duty cop didn't like it. He liked it even less when his shift commander personally drove down to the hospital to grill him and hospital security. Had he fallen asleep? Had he been skipping out? Had he left the body alone for any length of time? He swore up and down the only times he left were to take a leak, 2 minutes tops. He locked the door behind him. There was no one in the basement of the building when he usually took his bathroom break around 4 a.m. There was, of course, nothing on the cameras overnight, but as I mentioned, the emergency exit doors in the stairwells were not monitored, as they only opened from the inside. So we supposed it was in the barest realm of possibility that someone walked in the main entrance and hid out, or snuck in the side entrance one night, came downstairs to do their deed at 4 a.m., only to escape out a side door. It seemed improbable someone could move those bodies alone and that quickly. Maybe the police officer was lying in on it and even helped the perp. But that, of course, begs the question, to what end for the cop, or this unknown person or people? What possible motive could there be for that? They didn't steal or destroy evidence this time. It was simply bizarre. The shift commander was frustrated, but the details didn't point to anything plausible. The police did a very thorough investigation. They swept the whole lab for prints. There was nothing unusual. All people who had been there and were supposed to have been there. And not that many prints besides, as most of the time people wear gloves. They didn't find anything on the CCTV tapes. None of the hospital staff remembered anything unusual in the past month. Anyway, the techs carted the guy off and they cremated him. There was some dithering about whether to continue to hold him in light of these new events, but I think everyone was just as eager to get rid of him as I was. So he left that morning to get cremated. I followed up with one of the guys who took him, and he swore he saw John Doe go into the chamber with his own eyes. I felt relieved. He hadn't disappeared this time. Whatever this bizarre tableau was, it was over. And yet, imagine my surprise when he showed up again. It turned out to be a bad penny. I didn't even ask about the circumstances. I was afraid to. I'll spare you the details of the autopsy. There was nothing noteworthy. Again, no cause of death could be determined. He went into a locker. I sent the samples to the lab even though I knew it was futile. Can you guess what happened after? Yeah, we lost the body again. It only took a couple of days. This time there were eyewitnesses, though what they saw frankly raises more questions than answers. An admin saw a guy in misfitting clothes and a lab coat limping barefoot out of the lobby. She said she called out to him a few times, but he ignored her. She knew he didn't work in the building, and of course the bare feet were suspicious. She was worried he was having some kind of psychiatric episode, so she called security and the police. He went right out the back door. You can see him on the security footage of the rear parking lot. Just the grainy, monochrome back of his head. John Doe shuffled away from the building. The worst part for me is the clothes he's wearing. They're mine. I kept a spare set downstairs. He went through my things and he took them before he walked off. The admin is in the frame for a few seconds. She comes and stands outside, watching the mango. If you watch the tape all the way through, the cops get there, and she comes back out with security. They confer for a minute. She points them in the direction John Doe went, and they go after him. If you keep watching, a second set of cops pulls up and goes after the first two. And what wasn't caught on camera was the manhunt when the first two cops didn't come back. They stopped responding to their radios shortly after entering the woods near the property line, past the parking lot. The second set of officers couldn't find them. The next day, they brought in some local huntsmen who were good trackers. Then they brought in dogs from a K-9 unit in another town. When both of those failed, the police enlisted able-bodied volunteers to completely scrub the whole area, square foot by square foot. The manhunt lasted about a week before they gave up hope. It was a major scandal. People were speculating all sorts of crazy things. An escaped asylum patient has gone on a murderous rampage in the woods. The fact that he was a dead John Doe actually managed to get swept by the wayside. He was clearly alive in the security footage. Everyone wanted to know who he was. We never figured it out. The car he was found in the previous time was registered to an elderly man, a few towns over, who had died of natural causes, and the car had been reported stolen by his son, who was the executor of his estate. They denied knowing John Doe, and neither of them could be proven to have any association with him. Nor did they resemble him, so the car theft didn't seem like a personal or familial dispute. The trail was cold. I'm ashamed to say I didn't join the search to find the missing officers. To be honest with you, and I feel guilty about this, I hope they didn't find John Doe. Missing men. Be damned. I couldn't bear to do another autopsy on him, and I resolved to quit on the spot if they found him. And lucky or unlucky, they didn't. They never found a trace of him, nor did the police officers who followed him. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, not even a footstep. It's been many years since then. I think he's gone for good. I don't know what John Doe wanted, but I guess he must have gotten it somehow. Or maybe he's haunting some other benighted me's office somewhere. I'll tell you, while I like my job and I always have, I've hated unzipping body bags since then. I'm always half afraid it will be John Doe in there, laughing at me. My retirement is coming up soon, and I'm looking forward to never having to wonder if I'll see him again.